Thank you so much for joining us once again on this special edition of Behind the Blue. I'm Cody Kaiser from UK Public Relations and Strategic Communications. I'm joined by UK's Chief Communications Officer, Jay Blanton, and our guest on this special episode is Joshua A. Douglas, who is the Thomas P. Lewis Professor of Law at UK's J. David Rosenberg College of Law. And Professor, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
You teach and research election law and voting rights, civil procedure, constitutional law, judicial decision-making, and you are also the author of Vote for US, or Vote for Us. How's that?
I usually say Vote for Us, but it's purposefully has a double meaning.
Sure. Vote for Us, How to Take Back Our Elections and Change the Future of Voting, which is a book that provides hope and inspiration for a positive path forward on voting rights. And your most recent legal scholarship focuses on constitutional right to vote, an emphasis on state constitutions, as well as various laws, rules, and judicial decisions impacting election administration. If you're listening to this and you're wondering if there's a particular theme or direction where we're going with this, you might be onto something. Yeah. But the first thing I want to ask is, tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to UK.
Sure. So I went to law school in Washington, D.C. at George Washington University. I had been a political science undergrad, and my second year of law school, I took a course in voting rights and really loved it and got to know the professor very well and really enjoyed it. Wrote a scholarly paper that he helped me pick a topic for in the area of voting rights. That was published, and he basically said, you're pretty good at this, and half my job is writing scholarship, and the other half is teaching. I think you'd be good at that, and he kind of put me on the path to becoming a law professor. After law school, I went down to San Antonio, Texas, and I clerked for a federal judge for 2 years, working side by side, helping to draft opinions in that court, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. And then I worked at a law firm for a year in San Antonio before coming up to Kentucky.
Well, let's talk a little bit about your the focus of a lot of your work, which is the constitutional right to vote. We hear a lot in the news from time to time about, you might see stories about disenfranchised voters or voter fraud, those types of things. Are those the types of things you're looking at, or what am I missing? What is the big picture of kind of what you look at as far as the right to vote?
Well, certainly those are major topics in my field. I often talk about it in terms of voting rights, but it's actually even broader than that, a term that I would call election law, which encompasses the constitutional right to vote, the way in which people have the ability to cast a ballot, but also includes redistricting, the way in which we group voters into different districts in a legislature to then elect candidates. The law of ballot access, so how do candidates actually get on the ballot, which also involves the roles of political parties and all of the constitutional law and other laws regulating the political parties. Then once you have a candidate, you have the campaign and running the campaign. So we can talk about laws and rules about campaign advertisements, about what you can do in terms of campaigning and different regulations, as well as campaign finance, a big area involving money in politics. And then there's sort of the nuts and bolts of running election day itself, often referred to as election administration or the law of voting, which deals with election disputes right before an election, like we had in Wisconsin the day before the Wisconsin primary, the election day itself, extending polling hours if there's something that occurs, and even post-election disputes about the winner, think Bush v. Gore in the 2000 presidential election. So, and that's kind of almost an overview of my course, election law, which is a survey in all the areas. Now, my scholarship tends to focus more on the right to vote issues and the nuts and bolts of running an election itself. So, things in the news include photo ID laws for voting is probably one of the most prevalent, or felon disenfranchisement, or things of that nature.
So It seems
Go
like
ahead, Cody.
with all of the different things that you've touched on, not only a lot of moving pieces and a lot of complications there as far as like things to focus on, but I'm assuming that there are a lot of differences from state to state based on how their particular systems are set up, which may make things even more complicated.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I often say that we don't have an election day. We don't even really have 50 election days in the states. We actually have thousands of election days that all happen to occur at the same time on the same day. And that's because our elections are run, by the states in part, but even by the localities. And there are differences in the ways in which different localities, different counties run their elections, from things like different machines that are used. Certainly polling hours may differ between states. And we have a really decentralized system. And so there's a lot of stuff that can go on the ground in how you run an election. Of course, there are sort of top-down rules coming from the U.S. Constitution. Federal law has some things to say, like the Voting Rights Act, but really state laws and then the way in which localities implement those state laws are the most important.
Does it seem like it's run in the sense of like a McDonald's? You go to McDonald's anywhere in the country and it's going to taste pretty much the same wherever you go. And this doesn't seem like that at all.
No, not really. I mean, there are some universal rules, right? There are some rules that you have to comply with that come from the U.S. Constitution or federal law, but there's a lot of variation. And that's both good and bad, right? I mean, it's good because you can try things out at the local level. For everyone who says we should have a national uniform federal voting rule, well, what if that voting rule was that every place had to use the butterfly ballot from the 2000 presidential election, a very confusing ballot in Palm Beach County that led to a ton of disenfranchised voters? If that was the national standard, you'd have even more of a mess. So I think it's good to allow some local experimentation. In fact, so I have this phrase I use in my scholarship. So Justice Louis Brandeis of the Supreme Court once said that states are laboratories of democracy, that a courageous state can try something new, and if it works, other states will follow. And I like to say that if states are laboratories of democracy, then cities and counties can be test tubes of democracy that try something out on an even smaller scale. And if it works, it'll then spread. And we see that in lots of areas. Women's suffrage, for example. We're celebrating the centennial of the women's suffrage movement and the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Well, that started really at the local level first and then started to spread state by state. And eventually there's a tipping point with the 19th Amendment. And tons of election reforms we see actually happen at that local way.
Is a downside, though, to this patchwork of elections and election laws? Are we seeing that now manifest in the era of coronavirus with all these different elections going on, questions about whether to do them or not, how to do them, when to do them? What level of complexity does that add to the election process? I
think that's right. I mean, you have a situation where really the coronavirus is everywhere and it's affecting everywhere largely in the same way. And yet you have different interpretations based on different state laws as to who has the authority to delay the primary election, the way in which it should come down. We had a ruling from the U.S. Supreme Court the night before the Wisconsin primary on Tuesday, and it leads to a big mess. So there are some downsides to not having at least some uniform standards. I would hope that as a uniform norm or principle, we could say that everyone who's eligible should have easy access to the ballot, especially in a national emergency. And that shouldn't be a partisan statement. Unfortunately, it has become a partisan statement, at least in Wisconsin, and then all the way up to the Supreme Court, which issued a 5-4 ruling in the case on ideological lines.
Well, that is one of the things that we wanted to really focus on was how our voting process is affected while we are dealing with COVID-19 and how that impacts everything. This is, the biggest of election years in a sense. It's a presidential year, so it's every 4 years we have this big election year. Lots more people showing up at the polls compared to off years, quote unquote. We've now postponed our primary here in Kentucky, along with 14 other states and Puerto Rico. We've moved ours from May 19th to June 23rd. First of all, what kind of process is involved in trying to make something like that happen? And I know that varies from state to state. So how difficult is that to move that primary?
Yeah, it's really dependent on the state law. Here in Kentucky, it was relatively easy because the emergency statute, the statute that provides the governor emergency powers, deals with elections explicitly. And it says that the governor, upon the recommendation of the Secretary of State, can delay an election for up to 35 days. And so that was simply a conversation, really, between Governor Beshear, who's a Democrat, and Secretary of State Mike Adams, who's a Republican. And they both agreed that the primary should be moved. The Secretary of State wrote a formal letter with a recommendation to the governor, and the governor accepted it as part of an executive order. And so that was relatively clean, in fact. And the other good thing, and I think Kentucky's looking really good right now, is that they acted really early. I mean, they did this weeks before the scheduled May 19th election and delayed it to June 23rd, which did two things. It, one, gave a lot of clarity for voters and election officials without sort of waiting for the process to start. And it also gave the state more time to change its procedures and processes for actually running election day on June 23rd. We can talk about that in a moment. But contrast that with what's happened in Ohio and Wisconsin. In both states, the governors there said, I don't think I have the authority to delay the election day for the primary unilaterally. And so they involved the courts. The courts ended up ruling against them, and it was a complete mess, leading to confusion and litigation on the night before the election in both states. In Ohio, the governor ended up closing polling places as a health emergency, so there couldn't be in-person voting as a practical matter, but he didn't unilaterally cancel election day. He did it as a public health issue. The Wisconsin governor said he didn't have the authority to do that either, but then after the courts rejected him, he did it anyway. And then that went up to the Wisconsin Supreme Court. In the meantime, the federal courts changed the rules for absentee balloting and when absentee ballots could arrive and when they had to be postmarked. And that went to the U.S. Supreme Court. So just a complete mess in Ohio, but even more so in Wisconsin as compared to the way Kentucky handled it.
So are there some, to that end then, are there some reforms that you think should happen across the country on a federal level that would help in these kinds of situations?
Well, one problem is that 17 states, and Kentucky is one of them, still require an excuse to vote absentee ballot. So in 33 states plus DC, voters don't have to provide an excuse. They can just seek an absentee ballot and they'll receive one. But voters in 17 states, including Kentucky, have to demonstrate an excuse, like you're going to be out of the county on election day, your work responsibilities, et cetera. So at a minimum, I think Congress does have the power to do this. Congress could simply mandate that states allow for no excuse absentee ballot. So that's a first minimum step. And I know that the Secretary of State here in Kentucky, I've been working with him, and I know that he's working on trying to come up with a plan for the June 23rd election. Now, some states run their elections entirely via the mail. They started in Oregon about a decade or so ago. I tell the story of the origin of this in my book that you mentioned, and it spread to a handful of states. And now 5 states run their elections entirely via the mails, even before coronavirus. I think it would be a mistake to try to implement that for this year because it takes a long time to get the logistics worked out to go to a universal vote by mail system. I do think we should. I think all of the benefits of it are proven. It improves turnout, it improves confidence, it lowers costs. They don't have fraud concerns, especially because like in Oregon, for example, they hire forensic experts in handwriting to do signature matches. Once the machines initially say there's not a signature match between the signature on file and the signature on the mail-in ballot. So I think in the long run, we should move to universal vote by mail. But at a minimum, I think Congress could mandate at least no excuse absentee voting for this year.
And vote by mail, basically, would that work like if every registered voter would get a ballot in the mail and then they would then fill that out at their leisure? They'd have a cutoff date to send that in by. And then I think I've heard that would they have like a code that they could then go and check to see if their vote was recorded correctly?
That's exactly right. So every voter that's on the rolls, registered voter, would automatically receive a ballot via the mail a couple weeks before Election Day. They can take their time to educate themselves about the issues, learn about the candidates. And in fact, the better term for it is vote at home. There's an organization called the National Vote at Home Institute, of which I'm a member of their advisory board, that advocates for these policies. And because this, what really you're doing is you're voting at home and then you're delivering it via the mail or through a secure drop box. And actually, before coronavirus concerns in the states that have this, about half of the voters preferred to drop their ballot off at a drop box. And then it has a unique code that you can trace. It's called ballot trace in some states, where you can actually sort of trace your ballot through the system. And it won't record publicly who you voted for, but you can trace the process of the ballot through the delivery system, through the acceptance to make sure it's been accepted or not, or if it's been rejected, for example, by a signature mismatch, although the jurisdiction will also notify you, and whether it's been counted properly or not.
If we're looking out at, God forbid, continued problem, crisis, when we get to the November national elections, are there things you think we ought to be thinking about or doing to make that process more secure, fairer, safer?
Yeah, well, we need to start now, right? We can't wait till a couple weeks before the election. And so we need to do things, as I already mentioned, ensure for no excuse absentee voting. We need to ramp up the capacity for mail-in ballots, even if we're not going to have, even let's hope that coronavirus is not still affecting us. You're still going to see a surge in mail-in ballots, I think, this year because of the lingering effects. So we need to train more people. We need to get more poll workers, especially poll workers that are younger, because we know older populations are more susceptible to harm from the coronavirus. And so there's a poll worker training and recruitment. There's, working with the voting machine vendors to be able to process thousands, if not millions, of mail-in ballots. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done now to prepare for the possibility or the reality that our elections are going to look pretty different, not only for the primaries currently, but for the November 3rd election as well.
So just to kind of, I guess, be a bit of a myth buster in a sense, I've heard both sides of the argument
here it comes.
in regards to November. On one side, people saying, well, mostly people who are not fans of our current president saying, well, he's just going to cancel the election, or he's going to postpone it, and he's just not going to hold it. And then you have the other side who are, saying, we have to have it. You cannot, you're required by law to have the election in November. Where obviously the truth is somewhere in the middle of those two things. What is the truth behind that?
Well, actually, this is an example where the truth is not in the middle. The truth is very, very clear. This is also probably the number one question I've been asked over the past several weeks by the media, by the public. I had a tweet that went kind of viral that discussed this. No, Donald Trump does not have the authority to postpone the election. There's literally nothing he can do to delay the election to keep himself in office. This is based on the U.S. Constitution. The Constitution very clearly says that Congress, and only Congress, sets the date of the election. The Constitution also very clearly says that the president's first term expires on January 20th, 2021 at noon, the ending of the presidential term. Now, people have come back to me and said, well, what if he declares martial law? Doesn't matter. The Supreme Court has been clear that a declaration of martial law does not suspend the Constitution. That's really mostly about the ability of civil courts to hear cases. And even this Supreme Court, which is has a conservative majority, it would be shocking to me for them to read the language of the Constitution that says only Congress can set the date of the election and say, well, but in a national emergency, the president can do so as well. The election will occur on November 3rd. It is abundantly clear, unless we're really in a world in which, up is completely down and the Supreme Court, reads very explicit text and chooses to ignore it. And, for all of these 5-4 decisions, there's an arguable basis for the Supreme Court's decision, even if we disagree with it. there's literally no arguable basis for the Supreme Court to uphold, let's say, a proclamation from President Trump that tries to delay the November 3rd election.
If
Could I have been clear?
that is totally clear, totally crystal clear. If we start moving towards things like vote by mail or vote at home, if we start kind of opening up to incorporating these types of things to where it kind of starts to I guess allow people to see that these things are not immutable as far as like our process, it's not set in stone, and we can make some changes to make it more convenient and more accessible to more people. Are there other things that you maybe see that we might start opening ourselves up to be more, and I'm thinking about things like ranked choice voting or like different kind of processes. I know we've seen like from the primary caucuses that we've had that did not go very well, that there's talk now that maybe we won't do that anymore. Do we start to see, because of the way that things turn out, that maybe we start being more open to trying different things like that?
I sure hope so. And yet I think we're already seeing a lot of that. The whole premise of my book is about positive voting rights reforms, things that we're doing to make our system more inclusive, more democratic, more convenient. I have a whole chapter on ranked choice voting. And one of the things that I did in my book, and one of the approaches was I only talked about reforms that have already been implemented on the ground somewhere. Because what I wanted to do was point to actual success stories and say, see, it's working there, so we can move it to somewhere else. So ranked choice voting, it's a great example of one of these test tubes of democracies where it started at the local level. San Francisco was the first place to do it in the modern era. In fact, we actually use ranked choice voting in places like Cincinnati decades ago, but the resurgence of it started in San Francisco in 2002, spread to cities like Minneapolis and St. Paul, Minnesota, Portland, Maine, and then it went statewide. And by the way, for those who don't know what it is, very briefly, instead of having to choose one candidate in among many, you could rank order your preferences. I'd like this person first, this person second, this person third, and then the rankings would ultimately determine who wins. It gives a much better sense of the electorate's preferences. And by the way, even the Oscars uses ranked choice voting to determine the Best Picture winner. And so now this is spread statewide. It's used in Maine statewide, and then a handful of states used ranked choice voting for their presidential primaries as well. So that's just one example. There's a whole slew of examples of positive reforms that either will come out of coronavirus concerns or just because I think we can make our system more democratic, more inclusive, more convenient. Registration reform, making it easier to register to vote. In Kentucky, we have one of the strictest registration rules in the country, where you have to be registered 29 days before Election Day. We can do better. The Secretary of State has been promoting a bill to reduce that to 21 days, which is good. I think he can go even lower. On polling hours, we have very restricted polling hours in Kentucky, 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. if you have in-person voting. That hopefully will be extended soon. We could talk about redistricting, which we mentioned earlier, how to draw the lines. Well, there's a big movement to put that into independent bodies as opposed to having partisan legislatures draw the lines. And I think everyone intuitively understands why it makes little sense to allow an elected partisan legislature to draw the lines that they're going to run for re-election in, because they have every incentive to draw the lines to ensure their re-election, not to ensure the most fair representation. Campaign finance reform and the adoption of public financing options. We see some innovative things going on in places like Seattle for public financing regimes, and even civics education. I think something that is really needs to be reinvigorated. And there's some great things going on in the context of educating not only our youth, but the whole citizenry. And we really need to focus on that. So, I have a whole menu of things that I think we can do better, and we must do better.
On the flip side of reforms, as we look toward November, what are things that concern you, maybe even apart from coronavirus, but areas we should watch, where there are going to be problems, where disenfranchisement is most likely to happen? What are the things you'll be watching in the November elections?
Yeah, so obviously coronavirus changes everything, right? And to what extent are states making it easy for people to participate? To what extent are the courts getting involved and issuing rulings that look partisan? On this Wisconsin Supreme Court case, I would have much preferred a 9-0 decision one way or the other than a 5-4 that breaks along ideological lines. Here in Kentucky, I'm very concerned about the new photo ID law. So the legislature passed SB 2, which is a photo ID law for voting. And a lot of people say to me, well, I always have to show my photo ID anyways when I vote. No, you don't. Under current law, you have to show some form of identification, but not a photo ID. So it can be a credit card, which doesn't have your photo, or a social security card, for example. So the legislature passed a new photo ID law. I was very, very involved in the negotiations about this law and actually got in a lot of good things to make the law more reasonable. Unfortunately, at the last minute, in the middle of all this coronavirus problems, the legislature met and stripped 2 of the key provisions that I think made the law more reasonable and took them out of the bill. Governor Beshear's vetoed that bill, but I suspect that the legislature will override the veto. And when that happens, the new law will be in effect for November. It will not be in effect for the June 23rd primary, but it will be in effect for the November election. And I'm particularly concerned because if we still have the coronavirus problems going on, absentee voters under the new law have to provide a photocopy of their ID. And there is a provision that says if you can't obtain your ID, you can fill out what's known as the reasonable impediment provision or reasonable impediment affirmation, which was put in at my urging, which basically says, I don't have an ID. I am who I say I am under penalty of perjury. And here's the reason why I don't have an ID. Unable to obtain a photocopy of my ID and I'm voting absentee is not listed as one of those reasons. Now, I'd encourage the legislature to put in what I call the catch-all, basically a blank line for a voter to provide another reason that's not on the list. And the law had that catch-all until the very last minute when the legislature stripped it out. I think that was very unfortunate. So I'm concerned about if we have a lot of mail-in voting, a lot of absentee voting, and you have to provide a photocopier of your ID, are people going to be able to do so? And if not, are they going to be able to allow to use the reasonable impediment provision or not? So it gets into a lot of technical details here, but I think the photo ID law, if it does get implemented in November, and also I think it's going to be subject to court challenge over the summer. So we'll see what the courts say about it. So that concerns me here in Kentucky. On a broader scale, I'm most concerned actually with election night or the days after the election, where you may have one side not accept the results. One of the features of our democracy is a peaceful transfer of power, and yet you have allegations of fraud. You had the last time President Trump won, he said he would refuse to accept the results unless he won. Well, he won the last time, but if he loses this time, will he refuse to accept the results? That's really concerning. We saw that happen a little bit here in Kentucky with Governor Bevin initially refusing to accept the results. And then a bunch of the Republican leaders basically said, look, unless you have evidence that there's something wrong, get on with it. And he did. And I'm hopeful that there's a bipartisan call, whichever side does it, whichever side wins, so we avoid that concern in November.
We don't want to take up a whole lot more of your time, and just wanted to see if there was anything that you felt like we didn't touch on that maybe we needed to talk about in regards to our upcoming primary or anything in that regard.
Well, first, make sure everyone who's watching goes to govoteky.com to check your voter registration status. The registration deadline is towards the end of May. I think it's probably May 22nd or something. I have to look it up, May 24th. But the election day is on June 23rd, so you have to have your registration updated by that. So just go double check, make sure there's no problems. Also pay attention to the guidance that comes out of the Secretary of State's office. I'll also publicize it in terms of how to request an absentee ballot. Right now you need an excuse, but I know he's working on a regulation that would allow for a no excuse absentee so that anyone could use a vote by mail. I'm always hopeful that that is actually going to get done, but you'll need to make sure you pay attention to the deadlines so you can vote absentee. And then, again, in terms of the photo ID requirement, know that it does not go into effect. Even if the legislature overrides the governor's veto, it will not go into effect until the November election at the earliest.
All right. Well, very good information, all of this. Joshua Douglas, thank you so much for your time. We greatly appreciate it.
Yeah, very much.
Thank you for having me. Really, really fun.
Again, we've been speaking with Joshua A. Douglas, the Thomas P. Lewis Professor of Law at UK's J. David Rosenberg College of Law. And I'll throw the book out there one more time. It's Vote for Us, How to Take Back Our Elections and Change the Future of Voting. And we appreciate all the insight. And one other thing. See, I didn't ask about the Electoral College. See, that I spared you from that answer. But yes, thank you so much for being with us. We appreciate it.
If we have another half hour, maybe we can go into.
We'll do it. But yeah,
We'll do a follow-up
next time.
Take care.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you very much.